She signed the divorce papers on a Tuesday. The same Tuesday, her daughter asked why daddy didn't love them anymore. The same Tuesday, the hospital called to schedule another round of chemotherapy. And the same Tuesday, she found out she just won the largest infrastructure contract in the country's history. $30 billion. He walked away from everything, and he had no idea what he just lost. This is a story about betrayal. But it's also a story about something deeper. It's about the things we don't see until it's too late. About the women who hold families together with hands that tremble but never let go. About the men who mistake strength for silence and love for convenience. Her name was Amara, and for 15 years, she loved a man who never truly saw her. Not her brilliance, not her sacrifice, and certainly not her blackness, except when it became inconvenient for him. This is her story. But maybe it's also yours. Amara met Marcus in graduate school, back when everything felt possible and the future seemed like something you could hold in your hands. She was studying civil engineering, one of 3 black women in a program of 200. The numbers alone told a story she'd been living her entire life, always outnumbered, always having to prove she belonged in spaces that weren't designed for her. Marcus was different then, or at least he seemed to be. He was charming in the way that made you feel seen, confident enough to walk into any room and make you believe you were the only person in it. They fell in love the way young people do, quickly, recklessly, without asking the hard questions that would matter later. She thought he saw her. She thought he chose her because of who she was, not despite it. They married young, in a small ceremony that felt intimate and full of promise. They built a life together, the kind of life that looks perfect from the outside. A modest home in a good neighborhood, careers that were climbing steadily. And then came Zoe, their daughter, born on a spring morning that changed everything. Amara put her career on pause, not because she had to, but because she wanted to be present. She took contracts she could manage from home, consulting gigs, smaller projects that paid the bills but never quite satisfied the ambition that had driven her through graduate school. She told herself it was temporary, that once Zoe was older, she'd go back, build the firm she'd always dreamed of. But life had other plans. Zoe was 8 when the headaches started. At first, they seemed like nothing. Childhood migraines, stress from school, growing pains that every parent dismisses until they can't anymore. But then came the fainting spells, the nausea that wouldn't go away, the way her little girl would wake up crying in the middle of the night, clutching her head with small hands that shouldn't have known that kind of pain. The diagnosis came on a Friday afternoon in October, delivered in a cold examination room that smelled of antiseptic and fear. Pediatric brain tumor. Stage 3. Operable, the doctors said, but aggressive. Amara didn't cry in that doctor's office. She held Zoe's hand, smiled, told her daughter everything was going to be okay with a voice that didn't shake. She waited until she was alone in the hospital parking lot, sitting in her car with the windows up and the world continuing around her. Then she screamed until her throat was raw. Until the sound she made didn't even sound human anymore, just pure grief and terror given voice. Marcus was different. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just got quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like abandonment even when the person is standing right next to you. That's when things started to change, though the shift was subtle at first. Marcus began working late, his hours at the office stretching longer and longer. He missed appointments, first one, then another, then too many to count. He'd forget to pick up Zoe's medication from the pharmacy, leaving Amara to make yet another trip after a 12-hour day at the hospital. She carried it all. The hospital visits that bled into one another. The insurance calls that required hours of advocacy and anger. The 3 a.m. panic attacks when Zoe's fever spiked and every shadow in the room looked like death. But Amara worked between the chemo sessions. She'd balance her laptop on her knees in waiting rooms, drafting proposals while her daughter slept with an IV in her small arm. Because bills don't stop coming just because your world is falling apart. And neither do dreams, even when they feel impossible. She'd been working on something for months. A proposal. A pitch so ambitious it felt almost arrogant to even attempt. A $30 billion federal infrastructure contract focused on renewable energy grids for underserved communities across the nation. It was the kind of project that could change everything. Not just for her, but for communities like the one she grew up in, places where power was unreliable and opportunity was scarce. She poured everything into that proposal, her expertise, her sleepless nights, her hope. And Marcus told her she was wasting her time. One night, after another 12-hour day at the hospital, Amara came home to find Marcus on the phone. He was laughing, the kind of laugh she hadn't heard in months, genuine, unguarded, alive. When he saw her standing in the doorway, exhausted and hollow-eyed, he hung up quickly. The sudden silence felt like guilt. She asked who it was. He said no one. Just a friend. She didn't push. She was too tired. But something in her chest tightened, a feeling she couldn't name but recognized all the same. 2 weeks later, she found the text messages. They were from Simone, his ex-girlfriend from before Amara, before everything. The messages weren't explicit, but they were intimate in ways that mattered more. Expressions of longing, references to shared memories, words that created a private world Amara wasn't part of. When she confronted him, he minimized it. Said Simone was just going through a hard time, that Amara was being paranoid, emotional, dramatic. He used that word often, dramatic, as if her pain was performance rather than response, as if noticing betrayal was somehow worse than committing it. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something. If this story is hitting you somewhere deep, if you've ever felt unseen, undervalued, or left behind by someone who promised to stay, do something for me. Hit that subscribe button. It's free, it costs you nothing. But it helps us keep telling these stories every single day. Stories that matter. Stories that reflect us. This is Our Black Diary, and you're part of this family now. Let's keep going. Amara tried to hold on. She told herself what people tell themselves in failing marriages, that every relationship goes through rough patches, that stress does things to people, that Marcus was just scared, overwhelmed by Zoe's illness and the weight of everything they were carrying, but the truth has a way of surfacing. It always does. She started noticing things she'd been too exhausted to see before. The way he'd shower as soon as he came home, as if washing something away. The new cologne that appeared on the bathroom counter. The pressed shirts for meetings that used to be casual. The way he'd take phone calls in the car with the engine running and the windows up, creating a sealed space where his words couldn't reach her. And Zoe noticed too. One night, her voice small and confused, she said Daddy doesn't hug her anymore. Amara's heart broke in a way surgery could never fix. Simone wasn't just an ex-girlfriend. She was everything Marcus thought he wanted before he met Amara. She was white, wealthy, connected, the kind of woman who fit easily into his corporate world, who didn't make his colleagues uncomfortable at company dinners, who didn't require explanation or defense or the exhausting work of making white people feel comfortable with her presence. Amara had always known, on some level, that Marcus struggled with her blackness. Not in the loud, obvious ways that would have been easier to name, but in the small moments that accumulated like dust in corners. The way he'd tense when she wore her hair natural to his office parties. The way he'd forget to introduce her to certain clients, leaving her standing alone with a glass of wine and a smile that hurt her face. The way he'd change the subject when she talked about race, as if her lived experience was theoretical rather than real. He'd say things like, "Not everything is about race, Amara," but for her, it always was, because the world made sure of it. And now Simone was back, and Marcus was slipping away. It all came to a head on a rainy Thursday in March. Amara had just gotten the call she'd been waiting for. The Federal Review Board wanted to meet. Her proposal had made the final round. She was this close to winning the contract. $30 billion, generational wealth, legacy, proof that everything she'd sacrificed had meaning. She rushed home to tell Marcus, her heart pounding with the kind of hope she hadn't felt in months. She found him packing a suitcase. The scene that unfolded was quiet in the way devastation often is. She asked where he was going. He didn't look at her, said he needed space. She reminded him that Zoe had chemotherapy the next day. He said he knew, but that he couldn't do this anymore. When she asked what this meant, he finally looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw nothing. No love, no regret, just absence. He told her he wasn't happy, She pointed out that their daughter was dying. He told her not to make him the villain. She asked what he was then. He zipped the suitcase and said he was done. She asked if it was Simone. He didn't deny it. He said Simone understood him. Amara reminded him they had a child. He said he knew and that he'd support her financially, but that he couldn't stay in a marriage that was making him miserable. She laughed then, sharp and bitter, asking how he could call himself the provider when she'd been working too, while taking care of Zoe, while holding him together. And Marcus said something that revealed everything. He said that was the problem, that she was always holding things together, always so strong, so capable, that he didn't even feel needed anymore. She stared at him, understanding finally settling over her like cold water. She asked if he was punishing her for surviving. He didn't answer, he just left. If you're still here, thank you. I know this one hurts, but sometimes we need to hear these stories, to remember we're not alone. If this is resonating with you, if you've ever had to be strong when all you wanted was to fall apart, leave a comment, tell me. I see you, Amara. Let's build something here, a space where our pain is witnessed, where our strength is honored. And if you haven't already, hit that like button. It tells YouTube this story matters. Let's continue. Amara didn't tell anyone at first. Not her mother, who would have said she saw this coming. Not her best friend, who would have offered comfort Amara wasn't ready to receive. She just kept going. Took Zoe to chemotherapy, smiled through the nausea, read bedtime stories in a voice that didn't shake. When Zoe asked about Daddy, Amara said he was working. She didn't know how to explain that Daddy had chosen himself. At night, after Zoe fell asleep with her small hand wrapped around Amara's finger, she would sit in the dark living room. And she'd, why do wrong? Was I not enough? Was it because I'm black? That last question haunted her most, because deep down, somewhere beneath the exhaustion and grief, she knew. She'd always known. Marcus filed for divorce 3 weeks later. His lawyer was efficient and cold, delivering terms that felt designed to inflict maximum pain with minimum emotion. Joint custody, but Marcus would have Zoe only on weekends when feasible, a phrase that meant nothing and everything. He'd pay child support, the minimum required by law. The house would be sold, assets split down the middle with mathematical precision. There was no mention of Zoe's medical bills, no mention of the years Amara had paused her career, no mention of love or vows or the family they'd built together. Just paperwork. Clean, legal, brutal. Amara signed, not because she wanted to, but because she was tired of fighting a man who'd already left. Marcus moved fast. Within a month, he and Simone were posting photos together on social media. Dinner dates at restaurants Amara recognized, weekend getaways to places they'd never been able to afford, smiling like people who'd never known grief or guilt or consequence. Simone was everything the world told him he deserved. Polished, comfortable, uncomplicated. She didn't come with medical bills or a sick child or the weight of systemic oppression. She was easy. And Marcus had always chosen easy. Amara saw the photos, and for the first time in months, she felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, just a strange, hollow clarity. She'd spent 15 years loving a man who was too small to love her back. 3 days after she signed the divorce papers, Amara got an email. The subject line read, Federal Infrastructure Initiative, Final Presentation. She'd made it, her proposal, her vision, her years of work distilled into a pitch that could change everything. She was one of 3 finalists for the $30 billion contract. The presentation was in 2 weeks in Washington, D.C., and she had no one to watch Zoe. She called her mother. She called her sister. She called the 2 friends who'd stuck around when everyone else got tired of her drama. And she built a plan, because that's what she did. She survived, even when the world insisted she shouldn't have to. And for the first time in a long time, despite everything, Amara smiled. The presentation room in Washington, D.C. was cold in the way government buildings always are. White walls, long conference table, 12 faces staring at her, waiting, most of them men, most of them white. Amara had been here before, in rooms where she had to prove herself twice as hard, where her credentials were questioned, her expertise doubted, where her presence itself felt like an accusation. But this time was different, because she wasn't doing this for Marcus, or for validation from people who would never fully see her. She was doing it for Zoe, for every little black girl who needed to see what was possible. She presented for 90 minutes, spoke about renewable infrastructure with the kind of passion that comes from lived experience, economic impact backed by data she'd verified 3 times, environmental justice framed not as theory but as necessity. She talked about communities left behind, about energy deserts in places that looked like where she grew up, about the cost of ignoring the margins, and when she finished, the room was silent. Then one of the panel members, an older black woman with gray locks and knowing eyes, smiled. She said, "Miss Johnson, that was extraordinary. Amara flew home that night. Zoe was waiting, pale and tired but smiling. Asked if Mama won. Amara said she didn't know yet, baby. But 3 days later, the call came." The voice on the other end identified herself as Director Cassandra Williams from the Federal Infrastructure Initiative. Said they'd completed their review, that she was pleased to inform Amara that her proposal had been selected. There was silence, then congratulations. Amara had just been awarded a $30 billion contract. Amara didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just sat down on the kitchen floor and laughed. The kind of laugh that's also a sob. The kind that comes when you've been holding your breath for so long you forgot what air felt like. The news broke the next morning. Headlines everywhere. Local engineer wins historic $30 billion federal contract. Single mother's vision to transform national energy infrastructure. Her face was on news outlets, LinkedIn, Twitter. Investors were calling. Venture capitalists, corporate partners who'd never returned her emails before, suddenly wanted meetings. Amara Johnson, the woman Marcus had left, was now one of the most powerful figures in the industry. And Marcus saw the headlines. He was at brunch with Simone when his phone started buzzing. Colleagues, friends, his own mother calling, everyone asking the same thing. "Did you see? Your ex-wife just..." He refreshed the page, stared at Amara's photo, read the number, $30 billion, and his stomach dropped. Marcus tried to call her. She didn't answer. He tried again and again, each unanswered ring a small death. Finally, he sent a text, said they needed to talk, that he'd made a mistake. She read it, deleted it, and went back to her daughter, because some men don't deserve a response. They deserve to sit with what they've lost. I want to pause here for a second, because this is where the story could end. Amara won, Marcus lost, karma delivered. But life isn't that simple, and neither is healing. If you're invested in how this ends, and I mean really ends, make sure you're subscribed. We're dropping stories like this every single day, real, raw, rooted in our truth. Hit that subscribe button, drop a comment. Let me know, has karma ever found someone who hurt you? Let's finish this. Marcus couldn't let it go. He started showing up at her office building, standing in the lobby until security escorted him out. At Zoe's school, trying to catch her during pickup, always with apologies, always with excuses that sounded rehearsed. He'd say he was stressed, that he wasn't thinking clearly, that things with Simone weren't what he thought they would be. Amara listened once, just once, and then she said something that broke him in a way he'd never recover from. She told him he didn't leave because he was unhappy. He left because he was ashamed that she was black, that Zoe was sick, that life got hard and complicated and he wanted easy. He got it. Now he had to live with it. He had nothing to say, no defense, no explanation that could undo the truth she'd spoken. Simone left him 6 months later. Turns out she wasn't interested in a man with nothing to offer. Marcus had quit his job to focus on himself, which really meant he fell apart. He'd lost Amara, lost meaningful access to Zoe, lost his reputation, and now he'd lost Simone too. She moved on to someone wealthier, more stable, someone who didn't carry the ghost of the woman he destroyed. Marcus called Amara one last time. His voice hollow, he said he had nothing. She was quiet for a long time. Then she spoke. Told him he had everything, Marcus. He just didn't know how to see it. And she hung up. Amara didn't celebrate his downfall. She didn't post about it. Didn't gloat. Didn't waste energy on the satisfaction of watching him crumble. She just moved forward. Hired a team of brilliant engineers and project managers, many of them women, many of them people of color. Built her firm from the ground up. Launched projects that brought power to communities that had been in the dark for generations. Bought a house, a big one, with a room for Zoe that had windows facing east so she could wake up to sunlight. and a studio where Amara could finally paint again, something she hadn't done since college. Zoe's cancer went into remission, not because of money, though money helped with the best doctors and the best care, but because Amara never stopped fighting, never stopped advocating, never stopped believing her daughter deserved life. And one day, a year after the divorce was finalized, Zoe asked a simple question. She said, "Mama, are you happy?" Amara thought about it, about everything she'd lost, everything she'd gained, and she smiled. "Yeah, baby, I am." This story isn't really about money, or revenge, or even justice in the clean, simple way we like to imagine it. It's about something quieter, something that doesn't make headlines. It's about the women who hold the world together while the world forgets to say thank you. It's about the men who mistake strength for convenience and love for transaction. It's about knowing your worth even when the people closest to you don't, even when you're exhausted, even when you're alone, even when every voice in your head tells you to give up. Amara didn't win because Marcus lost. She won because she refused to shrink, because she loved herself enough to survive, and because she understood something Marcus never did. You can't build a future by abandoning the people who built you. There's something else worth saying here, about the particular weight Black women carry in this country, about the way they're expected to be strong without being acknowledged, to be resilient without support, to hold families together, hold communities together, hold entire institutions together, and then be called dramatic when they finally say they're tired. Amara's story is specific to her life, but it's also a pattern of women doing everything right and still being left, still being undervalued, still having to prove they deserve the space they occupy. When Marcus chose Simone, he wasn't just choosing a person, he was choosing comfort, choosing a life where he didn't have to think about race, where his wife wouldn't remind him of injustices he preferred to ignore, where he could exist without confrontation or complication. And the tragedy is, he probably doesn't even fully understand what he did, probably still tells himself he was just following his heart, that he just wanted to be happy, never asking why his happiness required erasing the woman who built him. Amara's contract wasn't just about money, it was about infrastructure, yes, but also about visibility, about a Black woman standing in front of predominantly white institutions and saying, "I belong here. My vision matters. My communities matter." And having them say yes. That yes was powerful. Not because it validated her worth, she already knew her worth, but because it opened doors, created pathways, made it easier for the next woman, the next engineer from an underserved community who dared to dream big. The months after her win weren't easy. Success brought scrutiny. People questioned her qualifications, suggested she must have had help, must have known someone, must have benefited from diversity initiatives as if her intelligence and expertise weren't enough. Amara dealt with it the way she'd learned to deal with everything, with grace and precision, with data and excellence, with the quiet knowledge that her work would speak louder than their doubts. Zoe watched her mother during this time, watched her handle pressure with dignity, watched her build something from nothing, watched her refuse to shrink or apologize or accept less than she deserved. And Zoe learned something more valuable than any inheritance. She learned what strength actually looks like, not the kind that never breaks, but the kind that breaks and rebuilds, over and over, until the breaking itself becomes part of the foundation. There were nights when Amara still felt the weight, when she'd lie awake wondering if she'd made the right choices, if she'd somehow failed her daughter by marrying Marcus in the first place, if she should have seen the signs earlier, if she should have fought harder for her marriage. The guilt mothers carry is particular and persistent. It doesn't care about logic, doesn't care about fault. It just sits in your chest and whispers, "You should have done better." Amara had to learn to silence that voice, to understand that she did everything she could with the information and resources she had, that Marcus's failure to love her properly was his failing, not hers. She also had to reckon with her own expectations, with the belief she'd carried from childhood that if you worked hard enough, if you were good enough, if you loved someone fully enough, you'd be valued. That meritocracy existed, that love conquered all. Reality taught her otherwise, taught her that sometimes people leave not because you weren't enough, but because they were afraid of what being with you required of them. Marcus couldn't handle loving a black woman in a world that devalues black women, couldn't handle the discomfort of standing beside her when people questioned their relationship, couldn't handle his daughter's illness because it required a depth of commitment he simply didn't possess. Understanding this didn't make it hurt less, but it helped her stop blaming herself. The firm Amara built became more than a company. It became a statement. She hired deliberately, created mentorship programs for young engineers from underrepresented backgrounds, paid interns competitive wages so students from low-income families could afford to take the positions, built a culture where people's full humanity was welcomed, where employees could wear their natural hair without comment, where accommodations for disabilities weren't treated as burdens, where parental leave was generous and encouraged. She built the kind of place she'd needed when she was younger, the kind of place that sees you. Her project started changing landscapes, literally. Communities that had dealt with unreliable power for decades suddenly had stable grids. Solar installations on affordable housing units cut costs for families barely surviving. Job training programs created pathways for people who'd been locked out of the clean energy economy. The impact was measurable, real, the kind of change that makes life tangibly better for people whose lives are usually sacrificed for someone else's profit. And Marcus watched all of this from a distance, not because he cared about the work, but because he couldn't stop looking at what he'd lost. Friends told him to move on, to stop torturing himself. But he couldn't. The ghost of Amara haunted him, not the actual woman. She'd moved on completely. But the version of her he'd convinced himself existed, the version who needed him, who couldn't survive without him, who would come crawling back. That woman never existed. He'd invented her to make himself feel powerful. And reality had proven him wrong. Simone had moved on quickly. She'd never loved Marcus. She'd loved the idea of him, the successful corporate professional, the charming man who knew how to make her feel special. When those things evaporated, so did her interest. She'd sent one text after leaving, short and brutally honest, told him he needed therapy, that he was stuck, that she hoped he figured out whatever was broken inside him. Then she blocked his number. No drama, no argument, just absence. Marcus eventually did start therapy, not because he wanted growth, but because the loneliness became unbearable. He talked to a counselor about his childhood, his parents' complicated marriage, his father's criticism, his mother's passive-aggressive love. All the usual excavation of family dynamics that explains but doesn't excuse. The therapist asked him about race, about what it meant to marry a black woman while being a black man who wanted distance from blackness. Marcus resisted that line of questioning, said it wasn't about race, that he just wanted to be happy. The therapist noted that he kept saying that, kept centering his happiness as if it were the only thing that mattered, as if other people's pain was just collateral damage in his pursuit of comfort. It took Marcus a year to admit the truth, that he'd been ashamed, that he'd internalized messages about what success looked like and who successful men partnered with, that Amara's blackness reminded him of parts of himself he wanted to forget, that her strength terrified him because it revealed his weakness, that leaving her was an act of cowardice disguised as courage. By the time he reached that understanding, it was too late. Not because Amara wouldn't forgive him. She'd long since released him from her emotional landscape, but because the person he'd been when they married no longer existed, and the person he was now had no place in her life. Zoe grew up understanding her father through his absence. She didn't hate him. Hate requires energy and emotional investment. She just understood that some people aren't capable of showing up, that you can love someone and still need to protect yourself from them. She saw her father on scheduled visits that became increasingly infrequent. He'd take her to movies or museums, trying to compress fatherhood into 2-hour blocks. She'd be polite, cordial, but distant. The connection they'd had when she was younger, back when she thought Daddy could fix anything, was severed. He'd cut it himself when he left during her illness. Children forgive many things, but they remember who stayed and who left when things got hard. As Zoe got older, she asked questions about the divorce, about why Daddy left, Amara answered honestly but carefully, never bad-mouthing Marcus, but also not lying to protect him. She told Zoe that sometimes people get scared, that your father loved you but didn't know how to show up, that adults make mistakes that children shouldn't have to carry, that none of it was Zoe's fault, that illness doesn't make you less lovable, that she, Amara, would never leave, would always stay, would always fight. Zoe believed her, because actions speak louder than promises. Years passed. Amara's firm expanded. She won more contracts, spoke at conferences, was interviewed for documentaries about women in STEM, was invited to the White House. Her life became full in ways she'd never imagined during those dark months when Marcus left and Zoe was sick and the future felt like a closing door. She dated occasionally, nothing serious. She'd learned to be cautious with her heart, to vet people more carefully, to trust slowly. She met a man named David, a teacher who understood patience, who didn't need her to be anything other than herself, who showed up, consistently, without fanfare. They built something quiet and real, no dramatic declarations, just partnership, the kind of love that feels like coming home. Zoe liked David. He never tried to replace Marcus, never tried to be anything other than a supportive presence. He'd help with homework, attend school events, make terrible jokes that made Zoe groan. He treated Amara with visible respect, and Zoe watched that too, learned what healthy love looked like. Marcus heard about David through mutual acquaintances who didn't know how much it would hurt him. He felt jealous, possessive, angry. Then, slowly, something else, a hollow acceptance. The understanding that he'd forfeited his right to have opinions about Amara's life, that she'd moved on, built something beautiful without him, and that he'd missed it all by choice. The 30th anniversary of Brown v. Board of Education's school desegregation decision happened during this time. There were retrospectives, documentaries, conversations about progress and how far we still had to go. Amara watched one documentary that featured interviews with children who'd integrated schools in the 60s. Their stories of courage and trauma, of being young and black and walking through hostile crowds while adults screamed slurs. She thought about her own daughter, about the different but still present challenges Zoe would face, about the contract she'd won and what it meant for representation, about the fact that in 2025, a black woman winning a $30 billion infrastructure contract was still remarkable rather than routine. She thought about Marcus, too, about how his inability to handle her blackness was part of a larger pattern, a pattern of black people succeeding and then being resented for it, of black women specifically being told they're too much, too strong, too loud, too ambitious, too everything. She wondered how many black women had been left by partners who couldn't handle their excellence, who felt threatened rather than proud, who chose comfort over complexity. The question stayed with her. If this story moved you, and I hope it did, do me one last favor. Leave a comment. Tell me what this brought up for you. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're not subscribed yet, come on now. You've made it this far. Hit that button. Join this family. Let's keep telling the stories that matter, the ones that center us, the ones that remind us we are seen, we are valued, we are enough. The interesting thing about endings is that they're rarely as clean as we want them to be. Amara's story didn't end with Marcus's downfall, or her success, or even her new relationship. Life continued. She woke up every day and made decisions, faced challenges, experienced joy, dealt with disappointment, navigated the ordinary complications of existence. The contract brought opportunities and also brought stress. Success brought visibility and also brought scrutiny. Motherhood brought fulfillment and also brought worry. That's the truth of it. Life isn't a narrative arc that resolves neatly. It's an ongoing process of adaptation and growth, and sometimes just survival. But there were moments when everything aligned. When Zoe graduated middle school, and Amara sat in the audience watching her daughter walk across the stage, healthy and whole and brilliant. When the first community powered by her infrastructure project celebrated with a festival, and she saw children playing under solar-powered streetlights. When David proposed on a quiet Tuesday with no fanfare, just a question and a ring and tears. When she looked at her life and realized she'd built exactly what she needed. Those moments mattered, not because they erased the pain, but because they proved she'd survived it. Marcus never fully recovered. Not in the dramatic way movies suggest, with rock bottom and redemption arcs. He just sort of faded into a smaller version of himself, got a different job, dated people who didn't challenge him, built a life that was fine. Not terrible, not great, just fine. The mediocrity he'd chosen felt appropriate somehow, a punishment that fit the crime. He saw Zoe occasionally, graduations, birthdays, major events where his absence would be noted. She was kind to him, polite, distant. He tried once to apologize, to explain. She listened and then said something that ended the conversation. She said, "Dad, I forgive you because I don't want to carry anger, but forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It just means I'm free." Then she walked away. He understood finally what he'd lost. Not just Amara, not just his marriage, but the possibility of being known, really known, by people who'd seen his worst and stayed anyway. He'd traded that for comfort, for ease, for Simone's temporary presence and a life that asked nothing of him. And he'd ended up with nothing. There's a particular kind of regret that comes from understanding too late, from seeing clearly only after the opportunity has passed. Marcus lived with that, would probably live with it forever, not as dramatic suffering, but as a dull ache, a persistent knowledge of his own smallness. Amara, meanwhile, continued to grow, not because she was perfect, but because she was willing to do the hard work of healing, of therapy and self-reflection and honest assessment of her patterns. She learned things about herself, about how she'd ignored red flags, about how she'd made herself smaller to make Marcus comfortable, about how she'd believed love required sacrifice of self. She unlearned those patterns, built new ones, became someone who could receive love as well as give it. The firm celebrated its 5th anniversary. There was a party, employees and partners and community members, speeches about impact and future plans. Amara stood in that room, surrounded by people she'd hired, projects she'd led, change she'd created, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Pride. Not the arrogant kind, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing she'd done something meaningful, something that would outlast her, something that mattered. Zoe gave a speech that night. She was 16, poised beyond her years. She talked about watching her mother build a company while fighting for her life, about learning what strength meant, about understanding that vulnerability and power aren't opposites, about believing, because of Amara's example, that she could be anything. The room was silent except for the sound of people crying. Not sad tears, but the kind that comes from witnessing something true. Marcus wasn't there. He'd been invited out of courtesy, had declined, sent a gift with a card. The card said, "Congratulations, you deserve this." Amara read it once, put it in a drawer, felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, just the distant acknowledgement of someone who used to matter and now didn't. That's perhaps the truest ending. Not revenge, not reconciliation, just indifference. The ultimate consequence of betrayal is irrelevance. This story isn't really about money, or revenge, or even justice. It's about something quieter. It's about the women who hold the world together while the world forgets to say thank you. It's about the men who mistake strength for convenience and love for transaction. It's about knowing your worth even when the people closest to you don't. Amara didn't win because Marcus lost. She won because she refused to shrink, because she loved herself enough to survive, and because she understood something Marcus never did. You can't build a future by abandoning the people who built you. This is Our Black Diary, where every story is a page, every voice a testament, and every ending is really just a beginning. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one. Stay strong, stay seen, and remember, the world may try to write you off, but your story, that's yours to tell.